Some of you may know, and some of you may not, that HMRC, about twice a year, issue what's known as the AML fines list, and AML stands for anti-money laundering. Anyone that they have been supervising or feel that they should have been supervising, who haven't registered with them and should have done, or breached the regulations in some other way on inspection, the companies are named, where they breached the regulations, and the amount of fine that they received is released in reports. Now, these aren't widely advertised per se by HMRC, but quite often other advertising bodies, magazines, that kind of thing pick it up. Now, we've been monitoring these for a number of years, but they're in a downloadable document, which isn't really easy. You can't filter, you can't do anything with it. Now, sourcing agents have to register with HMRC as what is known as EABs, which is estate agency businesses. And HMRC don't just supervise the EAB sector, they supervise a lot of other sectors. So the businesses that have been fined in these lists are from various categories of businesses. So what we did with the HMRC fine list is we manually went through them. So we checked all of the fines lists that HMRC had issued between January 2023 and March 2025. And firstly, we isolated the EAB businesses, and then we researched those individually to find out which ones were offering sourcing services or deal packaging. We reviewed each company's surface compliance. Now, what do I mean by surface compliance? I mean by what we can check publicly and easily searchable, such as, are they registered on Companies House? What is their SIC code? Are they registered with a Redress, ICO, HMRC? Everything else would have to be a desktop inspection because you'd have to get to documents and copies of insurance. So publicly searchable is companies registered on Companies House, HMRC, ICO. Redress, that's the TPO property redress. And we also did some research as to whether they had websites or a significant social media presence. And we isolated the companies who actually fulfilled all of those criterias that had been fined between that time period. Now, in phase two, we went a stage further. And instead of just researching HMRC's fine data, we went to Companies House and we searched for the term property sourcing in the name of a company. And it brought up about 500 companies, of which some were dissolved or in the process of being dissolved. So we actually ended up carrying out 482 publicly searchable surface checks on 482 companies that were registered with Companies House and had property sourcing in their company name. We checked each company. We searched on Google for websites, for social media presence. We checked what SIC code they were registered under. We checked to see if they were registered with the bodies that we checked on before. We reviewed their surface compliance. So we have two sets of data available to us. The first set was from HMRC's fine lists of those that had been caught either not being registered with HMRC or maybe were registered but had breached the regulations by not meeting standards. And then our phase two, where we'd search Companies House to find those companies with the term property sourcing in their company name. So from phase one, what's really interesting is the fact that a lot of the companies on their websites, whilst we were carrying out the manual checks, are on social media, LinkedIn profiles, Facebook profiles. They didn't necessarily say that they were property sourcing or deal packaging. They used, as you can see here, a myriad of different terminologies to describe themselves. Property acquisitions and sales, property trader, property advisor, property finder, property consultancy or consultants, search and find properties, property deal hunter, off-market properties, property searching, bespoke agent. They use an awful lot of different terms, too many for us to actually include up here and show you. So property sources and deal packages don't always use the same terminology. Why? For one, the sector has a very poor reputation. And if you talk to some of them, they'll say, I don't want to be bundled in with the property sources and the deal packages that are very, very poor. So I've decided to describe myself as something else. But the thing is, it doesn't matter how you describe your business. if you carry out any aspect of estate agency work in a property transaction, you're governed by all of the regulations and legislation that govern high street estate agents. So what you call yourself has no bearing on whether, at the end of the day, you could actually be caught and fined. It has no bearing at all. So from that HMRC report, 136 sourcing, deal packaging, whatever other names you want to call them, were actually fined over that 27-month period. And in total, between them, they were fined a little over £1.1 million. Now, that is a huge amount of money for sourcing agents to be fined. And you can go into Facebook groups, into WhatsApp groups, and you will hear an awful lot of them saying, oh, we're not supervised, we're not regulated, there are no fines being issued. It's the law according to NAPSA. All sorts of comments, but actually HMRC agree with what we say because they're fining you. So 51% of the agents fined by HMRC were not actually registered with a redress scheme, despite offering sourcing services, and you are supposed to be registered with one of the two government-approved schemes. And all of the 136 fines included breaches for failing to register for anti-money laundering supervision. So all of the fines were for those predominantly who failed to register. Sometimes they had failed to register and they were caught out for breaches of minimum standards as well. So phase two, that different research that we carried out on Companies House for those businesses with the term property sourcing in their company name. And we carried out 482 checks of the 500 businesses. As I said earlier, some of them were in the process of being dissolved, closed, various other bits and pieces as to why it wasn't worth our while doing the checks. Of those 482, 82% were not registered with HMRC for anti-money laundering supervision. 77% were not registered with the Information Commissioner's Office or the ICO for data privacy supervision. And 66% were not registered with a redress scheme, which again, all of those are legal requirements and they should have had in place. 60% of the 482 had no registrations in place at all. Now, I'm hoping for you investors here and you budding property sources, deal packagers, are getting the feeling that maybe that thing that I used to stand on stage and say actually wasn't far off the truth. Actually, it was spot on, because 90% of those 482 businesses were operating illegally somewhere in the business. And only 10% of them actually had all of the registrations. Now, does that mean that they were all fully compliant? No. Even if they had all of the registrations, it's likely that a high percentage of them still weren't fully compliant. Why? Because there's an awful lot more to full compliance than registering with HMRC ICO and property redress and having a bit of insurance in place. So I stand by the fact that a high percentage of even all of the 10% with all the registrations, a high percentage of those still would not be fully compliant. So 90%, based on our research, of those businesses were operating illegally somewhere in their business.